Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Liora Sarfati. Liora is a lecturer at the Department of East Asian Studies of Tel Aviv University, and an anthropologist by training. Her research tends to be long-form studies, involving personal interactions, repeat interviews over years, and a deep look at the interplay between human emotion, social interaction, and the broader society. And for today's podcast, this is going to focus around the issue of the street protests that have manifested in the wake of the Sewol tragedy, and then on to the Candlelight Revolution that removed previous President Park Geun-hye. Now, for many people listening, they will be aware of what the Sewol tragedy was. On April 16, 2014, a South Korean ferry sunk traveling from Sewol down to Jeju Island. And the response of the South Korean public at the time and since indicates that there was something about the tragedy that reached beyond the moment itself. It became a symbol for a much deeper consideration, a much deeper concern about South Korean society. Questions such as elitism, inequality, corruption, and greed came to the fore, with South Koreans asking themselves difficult questions about the values that permeate the country. But rather than this moment itself, it is the protest that came about as a result of this that is going to be the topic of the podcast. South Korea is a country that is used to the idea of large-scale public demonstrations, at least in recent history. And the Sewol protest, along with the later Park Geun-hye protest, touched deliberately on this history. Their protest wasn't intended to be an isolated phenomena, but a continuation of a much broader history. And as this interview will progress, it is often just this connection that seems to matter the most, this continuity over time, and this link between moments that may seem, at least from the outside, unconnected. A lot of the anger that was directed at Park Geun-hye after the Sewol protest was just this. South Koreans had an idea of their nation, an idea of leadership that she seemed to not embody. When it comes to the Sewol protest, it wasn't so much that she had violated some law, but she had stumbled over a significant moral infraction. She had lost legitimacy by not living up to traditional Korean standards of leadership. We are going to walk through this immediate response to Park Geun-hye, the anger and the outrage, the street protests that followed it, the macabre spectacle of abandoned classrooms, official interventions, and the challenging prospect of long-term memorials, where they should be and in what nature they should exist. But more fundamentally, this is a look at the people who were involved on the ground, the families who had lost loved ones, the protest leaders that wanted to change Korean society, the ordinary people that came out and marched against their leader and for a certain type of institutional change across their country. People that in many ways were demanding more, an end to old ideas, an end to corruption, and an end to an elitism that many people saw pervasive in their country and manifested in Park Geun-hye. We will walk forward as well to Park Geun-hye's ouster, to the figure of Moon Jae-in, how he positioned himself as the opposite of what she was, how he deliberately tried to become the candidate of the Sewol victims, and a champion for the street protests themselves. And through all the personal interactions, all the personal stories, all the tragedy, all the outrage, and all the disenchantment with the norms of society, underlying all this is a question of change. How ordinary South Koreans see themselves, how they see their nation, and which parts of their history they wish to maintain as tradition, and which parts they increasingly now see as defunct and needing of reform. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener, and if you do want it to continue, please consider supporting the podcast directly at the Patreon link or the PayPal link attached below. Failing that, you can always share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media, and I do encourage people to go onto those links and include any recommendations that they may have for future guests. I'm always responsive to good suggestions in this regard. On that, and to talk us through questions of morality and legitimacy, and a deep anthropological look at street protests and mass mobilization in South Korea, this is Liora Sarfati. Liora Sarfati, thanks for coming on the Career Now podcast.
Yeah, hello, nice to be here.
So we're going to be speaking through some of your recent research, but this is the kind of research which is increasingly unique in the world. So I might get to introduce it in a sense, because you didn't sit at a distance from this and do this turgid academic literature and piece through it in that way, but you were there on the ground and worked through a lot of personal interviews with not just the victims' families, but the protesters, the activists, the counter protesters, etc. So I might you to introduce the they released the research project that we're going to be speaking about today, which is the protests and the movement around the Sewol protests in South Korea.
I'm an anthropologist, and I study performance and folklore and traditions and the way people behave and talk about their feelings and actions. And I also study material culture, the way people express themselves with physical artifacts and any kind of something that is tangible. So in order to do this research, I had to go beyond words. If I would just do research about what people write about their text, I will lose many layers of behavior, of unintended behavior. And therefore, anthropology is usually classified as social sciences. We want to see how people behave, and for that we have to be there with them, right? So mostly we do participant observations and in-depth interviews, which would mean we might sit with people for many hours, and preferably we would like to be with the same people. So we rarely do conduct random interviews, like meeting a person, interviewing for 10 minutes, because we don't really believe, we anthropologists, we don't really believe that would bring us the depth of people's perception about the world. So mostly in my research about the Sewol, I interviewed and worked and observed more or less the same people. I would say probably around 30 people mostly would be the center of my research. Of course, there are people around there, and there are hundreds and thousands of people participating in the Sewol protest. But my in-depth interviews, were probably around 30 people, but many interviews with the same people, right?
And you conducted these on repeat visits. So looking through your research here, you started in 2014, and then you had return visits in 2015, 2016, 2017. What is the I suppose the academic purpose of all those repeat visits?
My first visit was not related to the Sewol at all. I came for the summer, for like 3 months in the summer of 2014 for a different project. And then I was living in Sajik area. It's very close to Gwanghwamun, and I was just passing by the protest stand. So, being an anthropologist, I'm always interested in what people do. And I started to be there with the people, mostly the families. It was the time when they had the hunger strike, and people were really staying there day and night. So it really fascinated me beyond my original purpose of the other research project, which is still ongoing at the same time. And then I wanted to come again and again. So mostly I participated after that in the anniversaries. In April, I participated in 2 of these. And when I came in the summers, again, I went to Ansan to meet the families. But my interest was mainly about people that are not the families themselves. It's not a psychological research about grieving, more about society and culture. I felt that the Sewol protest was changing Seoul's landscape, Seoul protest culture, and images, and the way culture uses images to mobilize people. So that was the purpose, the academic purpose of this research. How people use this disaster, and used not in a judgmental manner. I'm taking the word use as something that just happened, and people were employing it for all kinds of different personal and cultural and social purposes.
And
Does that make sense?
As a final walkthrough here, just before we get into some of those changes, and they're absolutely fascinating reading through your research over the past few weeks here, I've just been riveted by it. There is one thing that we should get out of the way, and I suppose we should give the listeners a brief history of what the Sewol is. We're going to be speaking about this a lot, and it's going to influence our discussion of Park Geun-hye and impeachment. So I might just as a brief introduction, what are we talking about when we talk about the Sewol tragedy?
Yeah, so in April 16, 2014, there was a ferry called Sewol. It weighed about 7,000 tons, and it was bound from Incheon to Jeju Island. It was carrying more than 400 people, and very close to its destination, near Jeju Island, near Jindo Island, the ferry sank. It became a tragedy when 304 people died while the ferry was sinking. And the tragedy was augmented by the fact that 250 of these people were high school students from the same class or same age group in Tanwon High School in Ansan. So 250 students plus other people that were regular passenger, including children, by the way, that were not students from Tanmo High School. And all these people were actually drowning while television was covering it. And the tip of the stern was still visible probably 4 days after the sinking. So people were watching live on TV, knowing that there are hundreds of people trapped in the boat. And, all kind of rescue boats hovering around, not doing much, which really annoyed, of course, the parents of the students, of course, all the families of the people who died, and also the Korean public in general. And from then on, the parents started demanding an investigation committee, and the protests grew larger in the summer of 2014 when Park Geun-hye, the president of Korea at that time, did not initiate any serious investigation of the event. So people were really worried that something might happen again if there's no investigation and no conclusion drawn from it. So that's how it started.
So let's build this up, because we're going to walk through a lot of complex issues here and a lot of change in aspects inside Korean society. The idea of politics and what is moral and what is not moral and what is legal and not legal, and sort of the dichotomy between these and how they clash together. And it has a slightly deeper history here. So let's step back for just a second here and go back to a little bit of Korean history. And you write in your research here that before the 19th century, there wasn't I suppose, a long lineage of demonstrations inside South Korea. It didn't have that sort of cultural aspect to it. And then in, I suppose, the late 19th century, when new ideas were flooding into the country, there was change on the streets, and suddenly I suppose a debate was happening and people were protesting. And this starts at a time of the late Korean monarchy here. And this is the idea that the Korean king reaches out to China, and he asks them to bring in soldiers to put down a rebellion inside the country. And this is one of those immediately, it's going to have big import for what we do later on, because this is one of those moments that begins to split apart what is legal and what is moral. Because, of course, there weren't any legal standards at the time, but, of course, it seems something that is quite immoral.
Yes, I find this moment in history pretty fascinating, because when you look at Korea's more ancient history, before the 19th century or pre-modern history, you really don't see many peasants' rebellions. You can see these in China and other places in East Asia. So I wouldn't say it's like a pan-Asian phenomenon that people didn't stand up for the right, because you do see all kind of uprising throughout Asia. But in Korea, we don't read about very extensive protests. And we do know that there were all kind of magistrates and officials that were corrupt and people were suffering, but they were not protesting in a manner of standing up to their superiors. And that's something that you can really see throughout the Korean history. And then in the 19th century, most historians, and again, I'm not a historian, but reading history, usually people would conclude that new ideas like Christianity that says, people are equal in front of the Lord or something like that, other ideas of kind of early democratization or all kind of other revolution that happened in the Western world, all these had some effect on Korea, and intellectuals started to view the oppression by the king or his officials as something that could be protested. People can say, I don't want to pay taxes when there's drought. So actually the rebellion is not really grassroots rebellion at that time, from what I gather. It's more like intellectual thinking. You have to change the Korean system, and people that are suffering have to stand for their rights and be treated more appropriately. And these rebellions are called Tonghak rebellion. People can find a lot of information if our listeners are interested in that. It really starts in the end of the 19th century. And it's so confusing to the ruling elite because they're not used to it. They don't even have an army, a proper army or police, riot police or something like that. And that's why they go to the Chinese, and then the Japanese come in. And I think modern history of Korea is kind of determined by that moment.
And that second thing you just mentioned there, the Japanese, this is going to be important because a lot of the questions later on about Park Geun-hye is the idea that she has let down her republic and let down her country through these immoral actions of hers. At least that's some of the narrative here. And at the time, again, so after that first moment when the Chinese soldiers are invited in, they are invited in again in 1894, but this time it's Chinese and Japanese soldiers. And it is seen by many Koreans as a moment where you let the enemy in, as in the Japanese in this case, and they never left, and you are destroying the republic from there down.
Yeah, I think that's the controversial nature of protest. You don't always achieve what you strive for. So when the Chinese came to help the king, pacify the riot, they were actually overlooking an old agreement that they signed with the Japanese, saying that none of them will send armies into Korea, because we have to remember that geographically Korea is just between China and Japan. And when Japanese, government started thinking about empire, Korea was the first target on the way to China, and therefore they signed this agreement like less than 10 years earlier, that neither army, Japanese or Chinese army, would go into Korea without notifying the other. And then when the Chinese came in to suppress these peasant riots, the Chinese came in, the Japanese thought they were actually bypassing this agreement, and therefore the Japanese sent their troops in. And then, we have this big China-Japan war, the first war in 1894. So, yeah, I think this rebellion had very unforeseen outcomes because of the international arena. I mean, the peasants were not really interested in that at that moment. And then, the Japanese never left,
And stepping closer to the current moment here, this moves forward, and of course a lot of people listening will be aware of the early days of the First Republic here, Sang Man-ri, and of course he is overthrown by student protests, only to be replaced by Park Chung-hee, which is Park Geun-hye's father, of course. And then this moves forward, and this, I suppose, this dwindles on, and it all comes to a point in the 1980s where thousands of protesters come onto the streets of Seoul and other cities across Korea. And what they're effectively doing is they are bringing about a concern about the hardship in their daily life and doing, I suppose, what hasn't been done too often before, which is blaming the authorities for the suffering in their lives here.
Well, it would be a philosophical debate to determine who is responsible for people's suffering, but definitely in the 1970s and 80s, many Koreans wanted democratization and felt that Park Geun-hye was not really treating the people the way he should. And also they felt that the richness, the economic success of Korea at that time is not showing in their personal lives because of the policy, because of the manners that Park Geun-hye administered, the flow of currencies and, materials. People were working in factories and exporting expensive goods while they were living in misery, especially in the 70s and again in the 80s too. So people, yes, they started demonstrating and actually they brought in democratization. So what's interesting in the history of Korean people's protest or mass protest is that they were quite effective. I mean, not always in the intended manners, but yeah, the Tonghak rebellion in the 19th century that we just discussed had very strong effect. Then protests against the Japanese had their, outcomes. And then this big protest against Lee Syngman in the 1960s actually sent him flying to Hawaii. Yeah, they brought in Park Chung-hee, but they still managed to oust the president. And then the demonstration in the 1980s brought democracy. So I think the Korean public is really aware of the strength, of the power of massive mobilization. And that's why they did again in 2016 when they wanted to, send Park Geun-hye home. And they managed to. So they're quite successful in their demonstration over the past 100 years.
And this is a memory that many Koreans have, at least as you've mentioned in your research here. This is something that Koreans are uniquely aware that they have this history here. So as we walk forward here, let's go forward to the Sewol. Now, of course, we've skipped over a little bit of history there and a number of other protests, but let's jump into the depth of the Sewol moment. And let's go to this, I suppose, a first demand of at least one of this protest movement, which was at the time the demand for a proper investigation. So why did this demand come about, and how? And I suppose, how did it progress?
Yeah, well, we were not surprised to learn that Park Geun-hye did not begin a thorough investigation. Many people suspect that there has been, or there still is probably, a lot of corruption within Korean official managing of industries and corporates. And of course, when the Sewol sank, it was very obvious that the ferry was not handled properly. It was not inspected properly. The cargo was not fastened properly. The crew was not trained properly in a rescue operation. And the government efforts to rescue the trapped passengers were also very weak because of all kind of structural let's say, privatization of rescue facilities, etc. So many people knew, and actually that's a fact, that there were problems that should be solved. And then if you start to investigate, finally you'll get to the people who are responsible, meaning people who did not revise, did not inspect, did not train, did not demand training of staff, etc. So the administration tried to overlook that. And then the parents and their supporters started to collect signatures. The signatures was to change the law that allows the government not to investigate properly. It's kind of complicated, but their goal was 10 million signatures, which they achieved after a few months. So the first massive mobilization beyond the families and their, direct relatives, etc., was people who were actually 24 hours in Gwanghwamun Square and also in other places in Seoul collecting these signatures. If you've been there in the summer of 2014, you would see them almost in every big subway station that you would come out of the station. There would be these booths soliciting signatures for this petition. Now, at some point, Park Geun-hye did initiate investigation. The problem was that the investigation committee did not have any official authority. So in one of my interviews of one of the lawyers that work in this committee, he told me how frustrated he was that he would send letters to summon people for interrogation. And the only people who arrived would be the people who wanted to be interrogated, like survivors, for example, were thoroughly investigated, the stories of other people who did survive the disaster, what happened. And this we know quite well from their interviews in this committee. But the responsible people, the people who managed the marine industry, all these people just would not arrive. And the committee didn't have any legal authority to bring them in. So that's why, at some point the government said, well, we finished the investigation, but the committee and the parents and their supporters felt that there was nothing serious, being investigated there. And definitely there wouldn't be any changes. I must say that this is the situation right now, too. The bereaved families are very frustrated with Moon Jae-in's handling of the situation because there's still no final conclusion what happened and how it should be amended.
And that is an interesting question about Korean society. So some people listening might be thinking to themselves, what role should a president have in disaster response, which of course is what Park Geun-hye was largely criticized for, and then also what she did afterwards here. But I suppose it comes down to a question of how Koreans see their leadership in a way, and they saw her as, I suppose, a protector of the nation, as someone who should have been there, who should have been out there, at least symbolically doing more. So just to narrow in on this, the concerns about Park Geun-hye and what she did at this time, they're not legal criticisms, are they? They're moral criticisms.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. During my stays in the protest camp and with the families and the protesters, most of the, very emotional assertions in relation to Park Geun-hye were about her personality. and not so much about laws or breaking the law, and not even about the corruption, financial corruption. So people were saying that Park Geun-hye doesn't have a heart. People were saying that she doesn't care that so many children died in her shift. People were saying that she didn't treat the families respectfully. They were expecting her to meet them, to show some kind of remorse for what happened. And it's true. People are not, silly. They don't really think that she could go, and save them with her own hands. But she had, in the opinion of most of Korean public, moral responsibilities for the wrongdoings of the industry that she is supposed to be supervising. So of course she's not a supervisor. And actually there have been a lot of research by Korean scholars about the laws that should be changed without the investigation committee, but still, for example, somewhere in the 90s or even in the 80s, Korea changed the law of how many years a vessel can take passengers, how old it can be. And that allowed them to extend the life of a ferry to 25 years. And in Japan, it's 18 years. So what they did with the Sewol ferry, that they bought it from Japan after it already retired there, because the Japanese are more strict in regulating that. And then they could have almost 10 years in Korea. And they bought it very cheap, of course, because the other option for the Japanese were to send it to the scrapyard. So the Korean law should be changed. That's what people are saying, like Korean scholars of marine safety. But then Park Geun-hye didn't do any of that. And it's true, she was not the one who initiated this kind of, change in regulation, because earlier on, Korean vessels lived as long as Japanese vessels. But still, she should have known, after it happened, that it was her responsibility to take care of the people. So that's about the ferry itself. And then the rescue efforts were so frustrating because she didn't show in the media for days. She didn't come to the parents. At some point, she went to Jindo. Some people were following and some maybe were not. The bereaved families were congregated in Jindo Island. It's kind of 5 hours drive from Seoul. And they had like a big gymnasium transferred into, I would say, it looked like a refugee camp. People were sleeping in sleeping bags and on mattresses on the floor. All the families, all the people who had kids trapped in the boat. And they were waiting, some of them for months, to get, the final word about their children. So actually divers were still taking out bodies from the sunken ferry for months, and some people stayed there until they knew that their children were rescued. So Park Geun-hye visited there once and kind of stood there up there and waved and said a few words and left. And people had this feeling that she was disinterested. She didn't really want to participate in the mass grieving. The whole nation actually was going through. So that upset people very much more than the legal issues. And, the legal issues are important, but had she taken it to heart and promised that she would do something, I think people would have excused her much more than they did, in fact. So that's about morality, yeah.
I might pause on that just for a second here, because that's such an interesting issue, and you do mention quite a bit here in your research. I suppose a dichotomy in the thinking of Korean minds in a way, because in some ways, as we mentioned earlier, Park Geun-hye's father was an authoritarian leader in South Korea, and in some ways this played against her when she was getting elected and when she's in power, but in many ways it also supported her and gave her some credibility. And you were mentioning there this kind of perception that she's heartless in a way. And when the criticism was coming back at her, it was she's just like her father. She doesn't really care about ordinary people. But in a way, part of her election, at least in some people's minds, and as you mentioned here, is they were electing her almost in her father's image. This was a slowing Korean economy at the time in around 2010 and onward. And this was a slowing economy at the time. And they thought in a way that Park Geun-hye could be this grand figure that could drag them out of economic recession, or at least economic downturn, like her father had done. And it begs that question, I suppose, that you mentioned earlier, that break, as in, this is a society that wants dramatic economic growth and all the things related to it, and at the same time, the sort of safety concerns that you mentioned, they run against the grain of that.
Yeah, that's true. It's what people expect of leaders. People expect leaders to be larger than life. She should bring the economical, factor forth. She should help the corporates, but at the same time, people expect her to take care of, civil rights, safety regulation, etc. And there is some internal contradiction. I mean, normal people would not expect themselves to be able to do it, but they do expect their leader to. So yeah, people expected a lot of her, like they expect of any other leader, and she didn't live up to that expectation. And could she? And that would be the question. When she was elected, people thought, well, we can skip some kind of let's overlook safety, right? Because people know that in Korea there is a very loose regulation of all kind of industries, and corporates get their ways in many manners. There was this discussion about working late, over, how people are paid for these over hours, etc. So people know that corporates have their way to kind of bypass laws. But when 250 high school students died, then the emotions around it were so strong that most of the people actually said, we would accept slowing down the economy, which is kind of surprising. When I used to go to the protest in Gwanghwamun Square, usually you'd have a large audience in the Gwanghwamun side of the square where the families were hunger striking in the summer of 2014. And in the other side of the square, you'd have the people who supported Park Geun-hye. And you would see very few people there in comparison to the people who supported the family. So I think the fact that Park Geun-hye was delegitimized by this disaster has to do with such, a large death toll, and especially young people's death toll. My feeling is actually that in Korea, as in other places in the world, maybe in Korea more so, death is a very, very strong factor. People can overlook a lot of wrongdoing, but when so many people die, that takes an effect. In many of the protests, there were narratives related to Korean traditional view of life and death. For example, the student who died, the young people who died, are people who have not married and they don't have offspring. So there's nobody who would conduct ancestor rite. And even if they don't really conduct, proper ancestor rite, in the Confucian manner, people still have this issue of, after my death, I have to have my children remember my legacy and remember me. So these young people who were not married yet did not fulfill their life, and, even in global meanings of the fulfillment of life, they are very upset. And when I say they are now spirits, right? They are the spirits of the dead. Many parents told me, I have to do it for my child. Of course, the child is already dead, but I have to fight, for example, for the changing of the law and the proper investigation committee, because I owe it to my child who died. And the kids are dead already, right? So that's very heartbreaking to hear the parents say, I'm going to sit here in the square until justice is done, because otherwise my child would not rest in peace. Well, and that has to do a lot,
Let's linger on that question of justice and death here, because one of the other things that keep coming up is the feeling that Park Geun-hye never really took responsibility for her actions at the time or afterwards. And this is contrasted by the principal of the school, who I believe it was the principal of the school, who managed to escape the ferry and then committed suicide. And as a result, the families of a lot of the victims and some of these groups that were protesting had a huge amount of sympathy for his family and attended his family. And it's a different kind of symbol, as in they weren't expecting Park Geun-hye to commit suicide, so to speak, but there was a recognition in the suicide of him that there was something, I suppose, unfixable that had been done here.
Yeah, I mean, it might sound hard to, accept, but there have been many similar suicides in Korean society by people who felt that they are responsible for all kind of wrongdoings, and by committing suicide, they are taking responsibility. So that's why people, and most of the Tangwon family members that I interviewed were feeling that his manner of taking responsibility was very respectable. I never heard people criticizing him. And, in my mind, I was thinking, he had family, he had children, and he committed suicide. So he was actually maybe harming his own family in a way. But never people mentioned that. People never said, he was, selfish, or he was not taking care of his own children, because his responsibility was to take care of all the children of the school, and they died. So it's fine that he committed suicide. I was actually very surprised to hear our people discuss his suicide. I think that people really expect people in charge to take responsibility in very harsh manners. And Park Geun-hye didn't do any. I mean, she could have come down and sit with the parents. Actually, Moon Jae-in did that. Moon Jae-in was often nicknamed the Sewol family's president or something like that. People would call him like that because he did come down to the protest camp and sit with them for a while and deliver speeches in their protest, in their demonstrations. But she never did. And actually, she wouldn't meet them. They had several marches from Gwanghwamun and even from other places in town to the Blue House. And they were asking to meet Park Geun-hye and hear from her an official apology, but she would never meet them. So that's even the beginning of the yellow ribbon that we all seen in Seoul downtown at that time is in one of these marches. They were actually sitting in front of the Blue House, and the police was preventing them from marching in, and Park Geun-hye was not coming out. And they were sitting there, and they started folding paper boats from yellow paper that people had there. People had all these writing pads that were yellow, and they started folding paper boats and, sticking them inside the police clothes and on the police buses. In Korea, they always surround protesters with many buses. So they started kind of sticking all these yellow paper boats on the buses. And then people started doing all kind of yellow tributes to the Sewol victims that we've seen later. So that was when they were sitting in front of the Blue House, and they sat there for 2 days until the police kicked them out. Actually, quite violently from what I heard. I haven't gone there at that time, but I interviewed people who've been there, and they say the police was pushing them out. And they were the bereaved parents of the children. They had the society respected them deeply. And everything was, of course, broadcast in the social media networks and not in the official news channel like KBS. So again, people said, Park Geun-hye is silencing everything. She's not coming out. She won't let the television broadcast all these events. People were really upset about that.
So you mentioned there I suppose, protest symbols, and this might be a good time to make a small sidetrack here and bring in some of the questions of those protest symbols, because anyone that walks through any part of Korea on the anniversary of the Sewol Singin will see these blue ribbons around. But of course, at the time, yellow ribbons, but it wasn't just yellow ribbons, it was yellow umbrellas, and even the protest camp that you mentioned in downtown Seoul became an image itself. And you've done research here on the idea how emotions build themselves into material objects like this, but then also those material objects become a symbol itself, and they grow in greater strength. So I might get to bring in those symbols of the Sewol protest. Why did those symbols become what they were, and why were they so important for the broader movement?
Yeah, I think first of all, it might be my own academic bias, because I always believe that material culture has a very significant effect on people's emotions. I must say that. But when I looked at the Sewol protest, what came to my mind, first of all, was that anybody walking in downtown Seoul, and that was the summer of 2014, anybody would see the symbols. So you could not ignore. When people started realizing that anything yellow was Sewol related, then whenever they went to work, they would see yellow ribbons, yellow umbrellas, yellow butterflies, yellow anything, balloons later. And the protest was yellow. They call it the yellow protest. But that turned into a situation where everybody was constantly aware of what happened. And we have to remember the children are not from families who are very rich, so they did not have many, financial means to take their cause forth, and it could be silenced, but it couldn't be silenced when it was present in downtown Seoul. I mean, people could ignore it if they haven't seen it constantly every day for months. But, things happen, people die. There were tsunamis and there were all kinds of disasters that, passed. And after a few months, people forget about it. But the Sewol protest was present in downtown Seoul until last March. So anybody walking there, and people walk there, it's the government complex, the financial center of Seoul, the place where people go when there is a football match, a soccer match, and people would constantly see these tents and the yellow ribbons. And I think that constant reminder kept the issue alive in the Korean culture and society for 5 years. And that's quite outstanding for compared to other disasters in Korea and elsewhere. I mean, I don't even think that in the United States, the September 11 symbols were carried on for 5 years. That's quite outstanding, even in global perspective. So watching these ribbons really brought to people's mind all the grief again and again. And that's what people said. Volunteers in the protest camp, when I would ask them, how did you start volunteering here? Or why are you coming here every day? And people often said that something they saw, something they observed, made them very sad. It would be mostly people would talk about the photographs of the student that were also used extensively. You would see lines and lines of these photographs of 250 students in all kind of banners and altars and in many places, and everything would be decorated with this yellow ribbon. So yeah, I think people watching things, feeling it, and actually doing it, because people were invited to write their thoughts on ribbons and tie them everywhere. So when you would go in Seoul, in City Hall and in Uljiro and in Kwanhamun, you would have a desk with yellow ribbons and pens, markers, and you could write, Ichimaseo, like I would never forget, or we will not forget you, or rest in peace. And people would write that and then tie the ribbon somewhere. Oh, no, it's everywhere, yeah.
Were the protesters conscious of the historical links that were at least visible at the time? Because the color yellow, for instance, has a history to protest movements of previous eras, or at least previous decades. And then the things like the burning of candles is something that's been done not just for death in Korea, but also in part of protest movements. So how conscious were the people that you spoke to that they were trying to link this to a much broader question about not just Korean history, but I suppose Korean society today and themselves to a broader movement?
Yeah, that quite fascinated me in the first year of my research, and I asked many people, why the yellow ribbon? Do you know the meaning of yellow ribbon? And most of the answers were no. People did not know. But the people who initiated the yellow ribbon were students who were aware of the yellow ribbon as a sign or as a symbol of waiting for somebody from the American culture actually. People who disappeared, soldiers who went to the army, and people were hoping for the return. Many families tied yellow ribbons around trees in the yard. So people knew about that, and there was the famous movie, She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, that was related to this kind of missing people or waiting for people who are in danger. But then when it extended, most people didn't know about that. About the past, people that I interviewed did not relate this yellow ribbon to other yellow ribbons. And yellow can be also political in Korea. So most people ignore that aspect. Most people also ignore the aspect that yellow in Korean traditional religion means ancestors, and sometimes it's royalty. People did not discuss that. My feeling was that for most people, the yellow ribbon just became the Sewol, and they kind of ignore the other aspects. About the candle, that's another interesting aspect. The candle protest, the candle vigils, the night vigils, people holding candles in the square that we've seen last week too, right? That's a new protest culture that began not in the Sewol protest. We've seen that in the 2007 and 8 in the FDA protest against opening free trade agreements with the United States and other countries. So that was 2007, 2008. The protest became peaceful protest. That would be a change from historical protests in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s when people were killed while protesting. So Seoul has gone a long stretch in how people express their protest. And now we see these silent protests, quiet protests, maybe rallies or parades where people hold these candles at night. We see that in the Sewol protest. but it's not initiated there. And it went through the impeachment protest of Park Geun-hye, 2 million people holding candles in the square at night, demanding that she quits. Many people ask me, aren't you afraid to go to protest? Because in people's imagination, protest is a wild, violent situation, but not so in Seoul in our times.
So before we get to those fascinating protests and the Park Geun-hye impeachment scandal and how this all ties together, which is really interesting, there's another, I suppose, a similar protest here that you attended yourself at times, and it's just really, really fascinating when it comes to the Sewol, and that is these abandoned classrooms here. So what were those as protest symbols, and why did they become so important?
Yeah, you would see that in the media a lot in probably 2015 and 16. You would see images of classrooms where all the desks, and in Korea, each child in Tanwon High School had his own desk or her own desk. So you would see empty classroom with the desk covered with all kind of items. For example, chocolate bars, soda cans, books, photographs, flowers, embroidered items, knit sweaters. You would see all kind of personal items. And these desks were in the classroom of this 10th grade disaster-laden age group in the Tanwon High School. So it's actually a building in Ansan where the school is, a building that housed these classrooms of the students. And in each classroom, you have maybe just a few survivors, right? So you have a classroom of like 20 students or 25 students, and only 5 of them survived, and all the rest died. So all the desks of these dead students became altars. The families would go there and change the food regularly. People would go and write notes for the friends or family members who passed away there. The blackboards were covered with, in the beginning, people write, "I hope you come back." People wrote these kind of wishful thinking ideas in the first days, but when it became clear that everybody died, then it started to be more like "rest in peace" and other kind of slogans. And the reason why we saw this in the media so much in 2015 is that at some point the school wanted to clear the classroom. I mean, imagine it's a high school where all the other students go to study every day, and there is one part of a building that is abandoned, and people go there as if it's a graveyard. And remember that many people didn't have the bodies of their children to bury. So for them, this classroom and this desk became the memorial of their child. When they held funerals for these children whose bodies were recovered, they marched through the building. They took them to the classroom to say farewell. There were all kinds of rituals held in the schoolyard, in the school building, while other students were going to school. So the Ministry of Education decided to clear the building. And for the parents, that was an immoral act, especially that people were still missing. I mean, many parents said, had my children been recovered, had I have a great gravesite to go to, that would be fine with me. But taking the classes now, taking them out now, all the desks, starting to let other children go into my child's class, sit on my child's desk, it's very hard to take in. I mean, you would see the parent, standing by their children's desk with all this emotion that they had. So there were several big protests when the government decided to dismantle this classroom. And that's when it came to the media. And it was a very, very strong image, looking at this classroom turned memorial altars for the students.
And there's a question there that you mentioned in your research here, and that is, at the time, there was a perceived, I'm not sure how you saw it, but a perceived lack of interest from the large, I suppose, the mainstream media, in a sense, the large broadcasting channels. This was covered, of course, but not covered by those large media outlets. And this brings into something else that you mentioned earlier, that is the idea that these often less well-off families, and this is almost seen as a way of brushing it under the carpet. And it's supposed it comes about in a climate at the time of rumor and scandal and I suppose almost conspiracy theory kind of talking. And I wonder how you saw that at the time.
Yeah, I think that actually all the commemoration sites in Ansan, in the place where the student used to live, it's about an hour by subway from Seoul downtown. All these places were much less attended than Gwanghwamun Square. So I think the center of the protest was not the place where the children grew up, and even these cool classrooms, people go and visit. And by the way, what they did at that point when they cleared the classroom, they actually wrapped very meticulously every child's desk and moved it into a specially designated building within the Ministry of Education in Ansan. And they have called Kiyokyoshil, the remembrance classroom or something like that. And it's still there now. It's like a museum. So they have these desks, the actual desks, and well, they forbid to have food in there, but all kind of other commemoration items are still there. So they reconstructed the classroom and people go there, but not so many. So if you want to talk about thousands and later hundreds of thousands, that would be Gwanghwamun Square. So people were more interested in the outcomes for the larger society, right? People wanted the Korea to be safe society, and that's why they protested. They wanted to oust Park Geun-hye, not just because of that, but my feeling is that the delegitimation process started with the Sewol. There is actually a struggle for legitimacy and for property and morality between the protesters and Park Geun-hye herself, but she was losing grasp. I mean, her the numbers of how many people supported her within her government dropped very significantly since 2014, and way before the scandal broke in 2016. I mean, she had maybe 10% of the population backing her. After the Sewol tragedy, it climbed a bit, and then it plunged again when the actual corruption and Chesun-shil scandal broke in 2016.
Well, let's talk about that, because that is one of the really interesting parts here. This is something quite unique here in your research, and that is the idea that the Sewol was more than what many people saw it was. It wasn't just something sitting on the side and a scandal in itself, but this was the beginning of the downfall of Park Geun-hye. Now, of course, she was later impeached, and she was impeached on a number of aspects, and we'll get into that impeachment in a way. But you posit here that Park Geun-hye, it all started falling apart for her at this time when over her treatment and how she behaved around the Sewol. So I might get to open that up a little bit more. How was this such a long, slow dip down? And I suppose you touched on there. There's an idea that she was losing legitimacy in the eyes of her nation.
Yeah, so of course, when people decided that Park Geun-hye was not really doing well for the country, I think the death of all these children was a symbol of that. I mean, she couldn't even take care of saving 250 students from the sinking boat. When we look at polls of, let's say, Gallup polls, we can see that by 2012, when she was elected, 51% of the population supported her. Then you see it dropping very sharply during 2014, and it gets to the 30% supporters. And then, of course, in 2016, after the scandal, it gets to like 5 or 10% of supporters and goes down later. So when you look at this chart, you actually see the peak of her support when she's elected. But people start to get frustrated with her. The economy is not, suddenly becoming very, very, good economy. I mean, Korea was still slowing down. People were hoping kind of that she will perform a miracle. Well, she didn't. So even her supporter in that respect, in economy-related issues, they were not very happy either. But then the Sewol, it was like, the country is grieving. She's not grieving. We have to mention that she disappeared for 7 hours, or maybe some people say 9 hours, right when the ferry sank. Nobody knows till now where she was, what she did. She never said. She never regretted it. She never explained why she wasn't showing. Suddenly she appeared. The sinking was at 8 o'clock in the morning. In the afternoon, she appeared in the media saying all kind of weird statement like, everybody will be rescued. Or later, she was saying, I don't understand why the kids are not found yet. I mean, they were wearing life vests, all kind of statement that clearly showed that she was not really interested and she didn't really know what was happening. So yeah, I mean, she couldn't, like you said before, she couldn't really rescue the children, but she should have taken some sort of responsible act or at least be interested. So when people started thinking, well, she's not interested in these children, she's not interested in our country, she's not interested in us as people, that's the point where many people started being frustrated with her. Maybe if she had performed very successfully on the economic field, people would have forgiven her. It's hard to predict because she didn't. But even her, her party voted against her in the impeachment vote in December 2016. So, nobody really wanted her in. And that's sad for her. I mean, that's her end. People will always remember her as the failed president. Not just the Sewol, but yeah.
And those two scandals, when taken together here, of course, one bleeds into the other. But it seems to be that they both represented in many ways the same thing for a lot of Koreans on the streets. And that was, they were both symbols of not tyranny, I suppose, but the power of the rich inside Korean society and the powerlessness that many people felt themselves. Did you see a connection between these two here, that there was a link, almost an elitist link between the two? Of course, it's very obvious in the actual corruption scandal that Park Geun-hye had with Chae Sung-sil and the admission scandals to universities, etc. But there seemed to be a direct link between that and the Sewol and the hopelessness of the families involved and the protests and the supporters involved.
Yes, when Park Geun-hye was impeached, when I read carefully the impeachment decree, most of the impeachment is not related to the Sewol, right? I mean, she was corrupted. She let people know secret, or her friend knew all kind of state secrets that she wasn't supposed to know. There were all kind of legal issues. But in the impeachment motion, there was a very, very large portion dedicated to her actions during the Sewol disaster. So and that was in kind of the words of the law were harnessed to explain further why she's impeached. So the impeachment motion mostly is related to other later corruption and misconduct that were revealed in 2016, and that's the reason why she's in jail, right? She's not in jail for what she did during the Sewol disaster, but still the impeachment motion said that the president should faithfully execute her duties, which she failed the Sewol. And they mentioned the missing 7 hours. She was not supposed to be missing when that kind of a large country crisis is developing. And she was not speaking to the public, so she was not protecting the public. And that's actually a law, that the president's role is to protect the public. So that's the manner in which the legal, process was kind of catching up with the public's process. And then when she was finally impeached, one interesting phenomenon that I observed is that people took the newspaper with the headline, Park Geun-hye is impeached, and they actually put it on the altar of the dead student. There were several altars. There was an altar in Ansan. There were altars in Gwanghwamun Square. There were several altars, and people were placing this newspaper with the headline on the altar, next to the food and flowers and all kind of offerings that people put for the spirits of the dead students. So that connects us to this feeling that the dead have to feel that justice has been done. And for the parents and many supporters, impeaching Park Geun-hye said justice has been done towards these dead younger people that never will fulfill their lives. So for me, that was the actual, visual proof that people connected the two cases together.
And into that space that Park Geun-hye opens up there, Moon Jae-in steps in, and he tries consciously here to do exactly what Park Geun-hye didn't. So he comes forward and he puts himself forward as the candidate that is for the victims of the Sewol. And he says in one of his speeches, he declares, and I quote here, "the president who never forgets the Sewol." And he does things like he goes to the square in downtown Seoul and he speaks there, and he does his absolute best to become in many ways the opposite of what Park Geun-hye showed herself to be.
Yeah, if we want to take it into the symbolic level, Moon Jae-in, during all these, speeches and public appearances, he always wore the Sewol yellow ribbon on his chest. And actually, several activists remarked that the ribbon that he wore was unlike any other ribbon. It was much larger. I mean, you've probably seen that there's many pins and ribbons that people wear on their clothes and on their jackets and on their bag. And there are many pins, like metal pins that people wear, but his was like 3 times larger than the regular pin. And protesters and family members always jokingly said that, when you're photographed, you wanted this to be seen. So he clearly wanted to be known as a Sewol cause supporter. And many people said that was one of the reasons he was elected. Of course, he was the head of the opposition, and he actually competed against Park Geun-hye in the election in 2012. So he didn't suddenly appear because he supported the Sewol families. But that was one of his manner to symbolically say, I'm different and I'm supporting the people. And he would come down and shake hands and sit with the parents. So he would do everything she didn't do from 2014, actually. You can say, it's a political act, and he knew that there's going to be an election at some point, so he wanted to build up his reputation as the Sewol supporter. Some other people think that it really was something that he did from his own heart. It's hard to judge there. But he really posed himself as the opposite kind of president. He will take care of the people. He will change the system. And if we want to jump back to our times, we are now speaking in October 2019, when all these huge protests and rallies related to the Minister of Justice are held in Seoul. So that's, again, the same issue. Moon Jae-in trying to alter the system and the law and the way law operates in Korea, and some people object and some people support him. And again, we see a big chunk of the population supporting Moon Jae-in.
So let's take that detour then, because that is quite fascinating here. This is Moon Jae-in coming to power, putting himself up as the person who is going to stand on the opposite end of what Park Geun-hye was. He's not going to be corrupt. He's not going to have special privilege. And those protests you talk about are the justice minister that he's recently appointed. And this justice minister has been accused quite similar ways to what Park Geun-hye was accused of, which is getting preferential admissions for family members or friends to university. So it seems to be a very similar scandal. And in many ways, Moon Jae-in seems, I'm not sure how you see this, of course, you might have a much closer ear to protests than I do, of course, but I'm not sure how he sees, but it feels in many ways like he hasn't learnt that lesson, or he's unwilling to learn that lesson, as in he seems to be just as deaf to the protest, as he's not coming out and removing the candidate. He's standing by the candidate, and he's seeing, I suppose, as Park Geun-hye did, feeling like this will wash out. I can ride this out. But as you mentioned, those protests in Seoul, they're quite large, aren't they?
They're quite large. I mean, unfortunately, I'm not in Seoul now, but from what I read in the media, people talk again about 1 million or 2 million marching. But many protesters, the larger chunk of the protesters, are supporting the change that Moon Jae-in wants to initiate. So that's a bit different from the protests that were against Park Geun-hye. But interestingly enough, if we watch these both cases, the public opinion again is going on the symbolic aspect of corruption in admission of children, of rich people to universities. While let's remember, Park Geun-hye was impeached and she is in jail for corruption in other manners. Right? So it's not about letting some rich people's children go into a prestigious university, but that's what the public remembers. But eventually she was impeached for other larger corruption scandals and state secrecy issues that were less interesting to the public. So if we take all this together, people in Seoul and in Korea are much more concerned with what happened to the younger people who die, people who want to go into universities, than they are interested in the larger issues of money, corruption, corporate, because the Choesung-sil scandal and the incarceration of Park Geun-hye is related to scandals with Samsung, right? So Moon Jae-in's issues now, again, taking to the fore the admission process of the children or of the wife of Choi-guk, On the other hand, changing the whole legislation process or the way the law works in Korea is the larger issue, which is downplayed by the protesters, right? So the protests are not necessarily on the larger issues, but on the personal issues related to younger people. And that runs like a string from the Sewol to Jason Chill's scandal and the current protest. People are interested in the life of their children in Sewol. Yeah.
And you mentioned there that the phenomenon of counter protests here, and let's bring that in for a moment here, because you do mention this in your research that in some ways the treatment of Park Geun-hye, for all that she did, has been unusual, as in it's been quite harsh, as in previous Korean presidents and politicians have been accused of corruption, but they haven't gone through the sort of things that she did. She was held before trial. She wasn't free to roam the streets, of course, or held on house arrest. And of course, you go back in Korean history, and people, even the members of government responsible for the Gwangju massacre, for example, were given less time in prison for this, and then they were pardoned very quickly afterwards. And there's a phenomena across Korea today. You can see it on the street corners around the place, and there was a large protest in Seoul recently, and that is the counter protest, as in release Park Geun-hye. There's a movement to get her released, or at least get her treatment, get some more lenient treatment of her. So how do you see those protests in the context of all of this?
So yeah, this is very interesting to me. When I was doing this work in the Gwanghwamun Sewol family protest camp, I rarely venture to the other side of the street where older people that are tagged as right-wing extremists or something like that, they were protesting against the Sewol parents throughout the period, and they were saying that the parents are just greedy, who want to, get compensation money, and they were saying that Park Geun-hye is not responsible, etc., etc. So these people, I didn't interview them at that time, but now in the summer of 2019, the recent summer, I spent a few months in Seoul, and I did go to their protests. So these people it's true, they are different kind of people. They're different social strata, mostly people over 60, so older people. The Sewol families always try to say that these people are paid to protest in front of them. My feeling this summer is that the people come out of their own sheer will. And actually every Saturday afternoon, people were marching throughout the summer, and it started several years before. People marched from City Hall to Gwanghwamun Square to protest in support of Park Geun-hye. This summer, I observed several thousands every Saturday. It was 35 degrees Celsius, and they were marching, usually starting at 2 or 3 o'clock. And then they had a large gathering in Gwanghwamun Square with, all their loud protesting that Park Geun-hye should be released from jail, that Moon Jae-in is actually a traitor. And we didn't mention here, it's not the topic of our talk, but Moon Jae-in also produced all the new, could we call it peace process with North Korea, or reconciliation process with North Korea? And that's again in contrast with Park Geun-hye's stance of very strong sanctions against North Korea. So the people that are protesting now, the older people that protest for Park Geun-hye, they want Park Geun-hye released. They want Moon Jae-in sent to prison for betraying the Korean nation by speaking with North Korea, the enemy. And they say he's communist. And that's a very interesting protest. I don't see it getting smaller. And, with the aging of Korean population, maybe we should start taking a more serious academic interest in the extreme right wing in Korea, protesting against Moon Jae-in, against changing the regulations, against strict, stricter law against corruption, etc., which Moon Jae-in is trying to promote. This might grow. We don't know. This chunk of population saying, let the corporates work. When Park Chung-hee let them work, they did well. So that's another kind of trend, yeah.
So as a final couple of questions here to wind this up, there's a couple of very interesting questions here that you must have thought about as throughout your research here. That is the broader questions for what this means for Korean people and for Korean society as a whole. And I suppose the first one is, how do you see now, looking back on the Sewol protest, how do you see it as changing things in terms of a movement here? Because you mentioned there as well that democracy takes time. And it takes time for people to properly internalize the idea that you can protest, and when you protest, you are safe, you're not going to be attacked, and you're free, and you can actually make substantial change here. And it seems at the time that the Park Geun-hye impeachment and the Sewol protest was a huge moment here. But of course, it all comes in the backdrop of something else you mentioned, which is the idea that this is a country that has the unenviable self-label of the Republic of Tragedies. It's got a whole series of tragedies like the Sewol, another ferry sinkings, bridge collapses, shopping centre collapses in the past. So do you see the Sewol moment as changing anything substantial now that you look back on it?
Unfortunately, no serious investigation or no final conclusions of a serious investigation have been published yet. And that's the frustration of some of the Sewol supported with Moon Jae-in and his decision on the matter. And there was no restructuring of the shipping industry, for sure. We would hope that something like that is maybe taking place kind of in darker sides, but I think if it would have happened, Moon Jae-in would have stated that as one of his achievements. So for many people, it seems that Moon Jae-in was elected, and then it turned to, handle the North Korean issue, which not all the people who supported the Sewol cause are feeling comfortable with. The reconciliation with North Korea is also a debated issue now in South Korea. And there was no significant change in safety policies. People in the working sector, like blue-collar employees, still fall from all kind of construction site, in places. There is a lot of frustration within this project of making Korea safer. And what I see now in 2019, after the mayor of Seoul actually dismantled the protest site in Gwanghwamun Square in March this year. And if you've been there, you'll see there is a small memorial that most people are not satisfied with. Also in the summer, many large kind of pots with trees were located all around Gwanghwamun Square, with the mayor stating in the media that the square should go back to the people and not to specific groups that are protesting. So big protests cannot be held there anymore between these trees that he put there. And there is kind of an attempt to normalize downtown Seoul and to move the protests away. But maybe if we want to be a bit optimistic about the democratic process, what we see now, the past 2 weeks, the large protests in relation to the Ministry of Justice and changing the laws or the prosecution laws in Korea right now, we see huge protests. And that's maybe the new legacy of the Sewol and impeachment protests put together, that hundreds of thousands of people want to go out to the street. And another thing that happened is that they do it regularly. So protests and demonstration are being regularized, I would say. So people know that if they'll go on Thursday night, there will be this protest. And it might go on now for months. And people, if they want to protest for Park Geun-hye, they know that every Saturday there'll be thousands of people marching for Park Geun-hye. That might be a change. I mean, the regular occurrences of protests and their extensive time and people who that are drawn to the protest. So the impeachment did have that effect, but not for safety as much, I would say.
What about the political aspect? So as a final question here, what do you make of if you see them at all, any political or social changes in this way? So we mentioned a few times throughout this interview the idea that Korean presidents are expected not just to produce economic prosperity, which often involves getting the best out of these family conglomerates, the chaebol, but also producing personal safety and a sort of parental safety aspect of it. You're meant to be there at all times. And that's why it seems, at least to me, that's why maybe you get people like Park Geun-hye being elected and then Moon Jae-in, is that they are these big parental type figures that come in and they feel like a single figure is enough to make the big change here. But I wonder how you see it looking back now as well, this idea that there are a lot of questions being drawn up through your research, questions about power, legitimacy, democracy. So do you see any changes in how Koreans see their democracy, or are they just more narrowed in on what they believed previously?
My feeling from talking to people is that these issues that the Sewol disaster has, put on the surface with all the emotional laden discourse around it, all these issues are still there. There is the health also on the situation of, young people feeling that they are not treated properly by the structural corporate-dominated economic situation in Korea. All these issues are related, and they have been tied to the Sewol concerns. I must say that as a researcher, I'm really looking forward to the legislative election in April 15, 2020, the coming elections, and to see how people talk, before the election, and how candidates present themselves, how these issues might be played in this election. And if we look at the date, April 15, it's just one day before the Sewol anniversary, April 16. So I'm sure there will be some, speeches, whatever, discussing the Sewol and the outcomes and the conclusions and what should be done. And especially that so many things haven't been done yet. So I would say that to answer your question, I would rather answer it next year after these elections, after I can observe and talk and, analyze these election situations and how people also treated. Because many people see Moon Jae-in as a hypocrite, right? He promised and he didn't fulfill his promises in relation to the Sewol family's demands for investigation. So let's see how this plays in the next election, and then we can be wiser. But that's an issue to follow, definitely.
Okay, well, I'll have to have you back on the podcast in a year's time, and then we can look through it. So the research I've done for this podcast, I'm going to link below. There's a number of articles online that you can go and read of Lioras. They're easily accessible, and they are all wonderfully good reads. I mean, the topic, of course, is a little bit dark and sad, and at times, of course, protests and the Sewol, but that's really riveting personal accounts, which are really worth reading. So I'll link them below, and I encourage listeners to go and read them for themselves. Liora, do you have any? Do you plan on following these protests in the future, or is your research taking any new directions here?
Well, it's taking the same direction, but expanding, I would say. I think now I'm looking at Sewol as a city of protest. I've been following these elderly protests this summer and the comfort women protests, which we didn't mention. Is a fascinating topic on its own. And yeah, I think there's something very special in Seoul. You always look for the special aspects of culture, right? So Seoul is the city that everybody who visits, watches the protests in awe. And like, there's always a protest in downtown Seoul. It's not like that in other cities. Now Hong Kong, I think, is taking the lead, maybe, but definitely Seoul is a city of protest, and that's my larger project now, looking at other kinds of protests that are ongoing in Seoul in the, let's say, 30 recent years or so, and contemporary, of course.
Well, I'll keep my eyes and ears out for that research soon enough. Liora Sarfati, thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's a great podcast. I've been listening to several of your previous ones. Yeah.